In these January Sundays, we are acquainting ourselves with the formative moments in Jesus' early ministry. So a couple of weeks ago, we read the story of Jesus' baptism, where he stood in solidarity with us in the waters of the Jordan River, was baptized as one of us, fully human, and then was claimed by God the Father as God's own beloved Son in a voice from heaven. Last week, we heard the story of the wedding at Cana, the famous miracle where Jesus turns water into wine. Except that's not really the point. The point of the water into wine is a demonstration of God's abundance, so that we would recognize God's presence every time we encounter abundance. Today, we come to the mission of Jesus. What has the mission of Jesus to do with the church? We come to a story where Jesus publicly declares his own mission statement, if you will. Mission statements usually land with a thud and an eye roll. You know it's true. Even the best mission statements and most carefully crafted do not get many people out of bed in the morning. There's a YouTube video that describes how mission statements can go wrong. It starts with the mission statement of a pizza joint in Wake County. The mission statement they had when they started went like this: to make the tastiest darn pizza in Wake County. And they did well with that mission, and their employees got out of bed because they wanted to make the tastiest darn pizza in Wake County. But then the company grew and they decided they needed to polish it. So they decided that make was not a polished enough word for a mission statement. They needed to change that to present. They did not just make pizzas, they presented them. And they decided that tastiest, they would have to scratch that and come up with a better way of doing tasty, so they came up with highest quality. And then someone said, well, we don't just serve pizza, we also serve subs. So maybe we should change it to Italian food. So by this point, they had to present high-quality Italian food. Someone else said, well, we also do parties and birthdays. So then they drifted over into quality entertainment solutions. And then they decided that it wasn't just for people in Wake County. They also wanted to do this for anyone who happened to come in the door. So at the end of the day, this nice, sharp mission statement of to make the tastiest darn pizza in Wake County became to present with integrity the highest quality entertainment solutions to families. A mission statement that would get nobody out of bed in the morning. My first job in a church was on the staff of a church that had been my home church when I was in college, and I was a part-time music director. The church had really gone downhill for a long time. It was really in a needy position. The pastor came and decided that what we needed was a mission statement. So I'll never forget the Sunday night service where we drifted in, about 20 of us, and he had set up a large screen with a projector and had a sheaf of transparencies. Anybody remember transparencies? They were all pre-printed with principles and bullet points. And we went through about 20 of these transparency sheets. And then we had a brainstorming session where we got to throw out all kinds of ideas about what the church might be. And he wrote them all down. And about the time we were going to get to something that might sound like a mission statement, he suggested that we let a subcommittee do the wordsmithing, and we broke. After sitting through that miserable experience, I remember walking away thinking, this can't be what Jesus had in mind for the church or for the mission of the church. When Jesus came to declare his own mission in Nazareth, he came to his home synagogue. He had developed a reputation as a great teacher. He returned back to Nazareth, to this home synagogue. If you've ever been to your home church, you probably know what this was like. Mom, maybe dad, brothers, cousins, aunts, uncles, the person that rocked him when he was a baby, were all there. And in the midst of all of them, he declared his mission. It was the custom in the synagogue at that time for the attendant to take a scroll and hand it to a person to read. So they would read from part of the scroll and then sit down. A scroll like that is on the cover of your bulletin, one that was discovered in Qumran. A sharp-eyed member of our congregation realized this morning that the picture is upside down. So if you know your Hebrew, you'll know the picture is upside down. If you don't, you would have never noticed. So Jesus took a scroll very much like that scroll, and he read from it. And when he was done, he handed it back to the attendant and sat down. Now, in the ancient world, teaching was done from a sitting position. So when he sat down, it was like the sermon was about to begin. A hush fell over the place. Everyone leaned in close. And Jesus said one sentence. Today, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. With those few words, Jesus claimed for himself the ancient promise that had rolled through the prophets for centuries, that God would send a Messiah to set the people free. And Jesus declared with the first word out of his mouth, today. It has happened today. Now, from the time that God first claimed the people of Israel and brought them out of Egypt, God's mission in the world has always been to set people free. To set people free to live in love and faithfulness. So when God brought the people of Israel out of slavery, it was to set them free from the hand of Pharaoh. And when God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses, it was to set them free from a life that was turned in on themselves, that worshiped lesser gods. That's what the Ten Commandments are about. Not about laying a burden on us, but about setting us free from the worship of ourselves or the worship of anything less than God, so that we can expand our lives to worship God and to serve one another. When God spoke through the prophets, it was to set the people free from political corruption and structures of oppression, to set them free from false religion that laid a burden on them without any grace. The mission of God has always been to set people free for lives of faithfulness and love. When Jesus comes into that small synagogue in Nazareth with his relatives all around him, he takes on that whole mission and says, today, this is fulfilled in your hearing. If you search through the book of Isaiah as we have it, you'll not find the words that Jesus spoke exactly. If you were looking in your Bible while I read, you would note there's no footnote there telling you where you can reference back to Isaiah. Jesus read a combination of two different passages, partly from Isaiah 61 and partly from Isaiah 58. It's a pretty common practice in the ancient world that he would read from bits and pieces. And there's one word in both the Gospel of Luke and in those passages of Isaiah that link these things together pretty well like a hinge, and that word is freedom. In the Greek version of the Old Testament, we find the Greek word for freedom, and we find that same word in Luke chapter 4. You'll see it translated as to proclaim release, or to let the oppressed go free. The focal point of Jesus' mission is to set people free. So a way of understanding Jesus is as the one who fulfills and carries forward the vision of the prophet and God's ancient mission of setting people free. Jesus begins here a ministry of release, a ministry of releasing people from the structures of corruption, the systems of injustice that Isaiah denounced in his own time. A ministry of setting people free from structures that perpetuate poverty, that steal opportunity, that rob people of their dignity and worth that they have as children of God, made in God's own image. Jesus begins a ministry of release, and not just release from the physical things that bind us, but from the spiritual and mental things that bind us. Jesus begins a ministry of release from sin, from the domination of sin in our thoughts and in our actions, for the entanglement of our lives in sin, such that even our best efforts are often tainted and miss the mark. Pat Miller, in commenting on this text, writes that Jesus has come to break whatever yoke binds us, spiritual or physical, to release us from those aspects of life in which we are bound and captive. The ministry of Jesus is always to set people free. So what does the mission of Jesus have to do with the church? If I could go back for a minute to that awful mission statement session I described, maybe we could imagine it differently. What if we could go back and take away the sheaf of transparencies and the overhead projector for a minute and ask one simple question? What do the people in this community need to be set free from? What does this congregation need to be released from? That one question, turned in both directions, could have done more for that little church to discover its mission than all the brainstorming sessions in the world. Because that community around that church had declined over decades, and it was in grinding poverty. Almost every house around there was practically falling down and was rented out to a family that could barely afford it. If the church could have asked that question, what does this community need to be released from? It would have discovered that community needed to be released from poverty, from the systems that perpetuated poverty. They needed to be released from drug deals on the corner. They needed to be released from crippling crime. They needed to be released from low expectations of the kids who grew up in that community. And the church, too, needed to be released. They needed to be released from a past where they had a vague sense that it was their fault that the church had grown so small. And they carried that guilt. They needed to be released from a vague kind of racism that said that their church wasn't for the members of the community. And they needed to be released from a kind of fear that said, we're not sure we can trust these folks to come to church with us or to be in ministry with us. That whole community was aching for release, to be set free. The church and the neighborhood. And we were drowning in overhead transparencies and wordsmithing. The mission of Jesus is always to set people free, because that is the mission of God. The mission of God is to bring about the restoration of the whole creation, all of it, by setting people free for lives of faithfulness and love. And our part as a community of followers of Jesus is to join in this ministry of setting people free, a ministry of release. At the last General Assembly meeting of the PCUSA, you may have read this. It was one of the few headlines that came out of that meeting. The stated clerk and others worked with agencies in St. Louis to provide bail money to release people who were imprisoned because of misdemeanors, and they just simply didn't have the cash to afford bail. These were things that ordinarily, if it were maybe you or me, we would have been out the same day. But because they didn't have the cash, they were imprisoned. And so our General Assembly at that meeting, that Saturday morning, collected $47,000, and they marched it down the street to the City Justice Center to give it to set people free. That's the mission of Jesus. Now, I wonder in our congregation if we could begin to think about our ministries and mission and our lives as setting people free. So maybe worship itself, this time of worship, is not just something that we come and do because we've always done it, but it is an hour, maybe an hour and 10 minutes, depending on how long the sermon goes. It's an hour where we can be set free from a concern about our own lives and the stresses and anxieties and cares that we have, where we can be held up in the Spirit of God and set free to worship. Maybe our time of confession and declaration of forgiveness, rather than just a stopping point in our liturgy, could be understood as a way of being set free from the guilt, the mistakes, the pain, the failure that you carried in here, and drown it in that water and be set free. And maybe when we take a meal to a person who's sick at home, it's not just a meal or a practical kindness. Maybe they're set free from isolation, from a feeling that it's all down to them and they're alone. Maybe our facility here, our fellowship hall, our foyer, our worship space is more than just chairs and couches and lights and floors. Perhaps it's a ministry of setting people free from loneliness, providing a place for people to gather and be in community with one another. What if our ministries to the homeless are not only providing meals and a warm place to be, but setting people free from a day with no dignity? Setting people free from a day where they feel that no one cares, and free to be in a relationship one-to-one with someone else. When we begin to understand the ministries of our church as participating in the mission of Jesus, of setting people free, it can open the doors to go further and to go deeper. How else can we be free to worship God? How else can we be free of isolation? How else can we be free of loneliness? How else can we be free from degradation and honor the image of God in one another? What else needs to be released? The mission of Jesus is to set people free, and it has everything to do with the mission of the church. It is remarkable that Jesus left no written record, no manual, no book, no religion. Jesus left behind only a community of people who would hear His words and say, yes, today we can be set free. And today we can set someone else